What would you do if a simple act of kindness sparked fear, chaos, and an unraveling mystery? That's exactly what happened when an 8-year-old black girl left a package on an elderly woman's doorstep. Within minutes, the police arrived, and what started as a sweet gesture quickly spiraled into suspicion, accusations, and secrets buried in the shadows. But was this child truly to blame, or was something much darker lurking beneath the surface? Stay with us as we uncover the twists, turns, and heart-stopping revelations in this gripping tale of courage, kindness, and the truth that changed everything. But before that, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. The morning sun painted golden streaks across Melody Thompson's bedroom walls as she sat cross-legged on her floor, surrounded by a rainbow of paint bottles and weathered brushes. At 8 years old, she was already showing the kind of artistic talent that made her father, James, believe she'd inherited her mother's creative spirit. Melody, breakfast. James called from downstairs, his deep voice carrying through their modest 2-story home. You don't want to be late for school again. Melody carefully placed her paintbrush down, examining her latest creation, a watercolor butterfly emerging from a chrysalis, its wings decorated with intricate patterns she'd spent all morning perfecting. Coming, Daddy, she called back, reluctantly leaving her art supplies scattered across the floor. The kitchen was filled with the aroma of slightly burnt toast and coffee as she bounded down the stairs, her dark curls bouncing with each step. James stood at the counter, attempting to salvage the breakfast he'd prepared while simultaneously adjusting his tie for work. There's my little artist, he smiled, though the fatigue in his eyes betrayed the long hours he'd been pulling at the hospital where he worked as a nurse. Did you finish your painting? Almost, Melody replied, climbing onto her chair. I just need to add more colors to the wings. Did you know butterflies can see more colors than humans? Ms. Parker taught us that yesterday. James set a plate of toast and scrambled eggs in front of her, ruffling her hair affectionately. Is that so? Well, maybe that's why your paintings are so colorful. You're seeing things the rest of us can't. Through the kitchen window, Melody could see their neighborhood come into life. Maple Avenue was a study in contrasts. Well-maintained lawns next to overgrown yards, freshly painted houses alongside homes desperately needing repair. Their house sat somewhere in the middle, not the newest but kept up as best as James could manage on a single income. Daddy, Melody said between bites, can we buy more paint today? I used up all the blue making cards for Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez. James's expression softened, but his eyes held a hint of worry. We'll have to wait until payday, sweetheart. But I think there's still some watercolors in your art box from Christmas. Melody nodded, understanding in the way children do when they've grown accustomed to hearing maybe later or not right now. She'd learned to make do with what they had, mixing colors carefully to make them last longer, using both sides of paper, and saving every art supply that came her way. As they stepped outside for their morning walk to school, Melody clutched her backpack decorated with hand-painted flowers, her way of making something ordinary into something special. The neighborhood was quieter than usual, with fewer people chatting on their porches or tending to their gardens. Remember what I told you about staying close to home after school? James reminded her as they walked. There's been some trouble in the neighborhood lately. Melody nodded solemnly. Because of the burglaries? I heard Mrs. Rodriguez talking about it yesterday when I gave her the card I made. That's right. Just be extra careful. Okay. James squeezed her hand. And maybe hold off on delivering any more cards for a while. They passed by the imposing Victorian house that stood at the corner of Maple and Oak. Unlike the other homes on the street, this one seemed to exist in a permanent state of shadow, its faded gray paint and overgrown garden giving it an air of abandonment despite being occupied. That's Mrs. Greenwood's house, whispered Melody, though they were well out of earshot. The other kids say she's scary, but I don't think so. She looks sad whenever I see her through the window. James glanced at the house, his expression thoughtful. Mrs. Greenwood's been through a lot, from what I hear. Sometimes people need their space when they're hurting. As they passed, Melody caught a glimpse of movement behind one of the dusty curtains, a flash of white that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Her eyes widened with delight as she recognized Snowball, the fluffy white cat she'd been watching for weeks. Daddy, look, it's the cat again. She pointed excitedly, but the window was empty now. I I see you've made a new friend, James chuckled. Just remember to keep your distance from the house, okay? Mrs. Greenwood values her privacy. At school, Melody couldn't stop thinking about Snowball and Mrs. Greenwood. During art class, while other students worked on their assigned projects, she began a new painting, a white cat with bright blue eyes sitting in a window. "That's beautiful, Melody," Ms. Parker commented, pausing beside her desk. "Is that someone's pet?" "Sort of," Melody replied, carefully adding whiskers to her creation. "It's Mrs. Greenwood's cat, but I think he's lonely like she is. He always comes to the fence when I walk by." Later that afternoon, as rain clouds gathered overhead, Melody sat in their small kitchen, surrounded by the ingredients she'd convinced James to buy with their grocery money. She'd saved her allowance from helping Mrs. Rodriguez water her plants, adding it to what James could spare to buy flour, sugar, and chocolate chips. "Are you sure about this, sweetheart?" James asked, watching as she carefully measured ingredients for cookies. "Mrs. Greenwood might not." "Everyone likes cookies, Daddy," Melody insisted with the certainty only children possess. "And look, I made her a special card too." She held up her painting of Snowball, now decorated with glitter she'd saved from Christmas cards. James helped her with the oven, his protective instincts warring with his desire to encourage his daughter's kindness. As the cookies baked, filling their small kitchen with a warm, sweet aroma, Melody worked on wrapping them carefully in wax paper, then placing them in a small box she'd decorated with painted flowers. "Perfect," she declared, adding her card to the package. Now Mrs. Greenwood won't have to be lonely anymore. The afternoon had grown dark with storm clouds by the time the cookies were ready. James had reluctantly agreed to let Melody deliver her gift, watching anxiously from their front window as she made her way down the street, protected from the light drizzle by her yellow raincoat. Melody's heart pounded as she approached the Victorian house. Up close, it seemed even larger and more imposing, its windows like dark eyes watching her every move. Snowball appeared at the fence, meowing softly in greeting. "Hi, Snowball," she whispered, reaching through the fence to scratch behind his ears. "I brought something for your friend. I hope she likes cookies as much as you like pets." Taking a deep breath, Melody carefully made her way up the creaking steps to Mrs. Greenwood's front door. The porch boards groaned beneath her feet as she placed the package carefully on the welcome mat, its cheerful wrapping a bright spot against the weathered wood. With trembling fingers, she reached up and knocked 3 times, then turned and ran as fast as her legs would carry her, her rainboat splashing through puddles. She didn't stop until she reached her own front yard, her heart racing with equal parts excitement and nervousness. What Melody didn't notice, as she rushed home through the deepening gloom, was the dark figure standing in the shadow of a large oak tree across the street. They stood motionless, watching as the little girl disappeared into her house, then raised a phone to their ear, fingers moving swiftly across the screen. In the growing darkness, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the figure remained still, their presence as ominous as the storm clouds gathering overhead. The rain began to fall more heavily now, drumming against the pavement and washing away any traces of Melody's footprints from Mrs. Greenwood's porch. Inside her home, Melody pressed her face against the window, watching Mrs. Greenwood's house and waiting for any sign that her gift had been discovered. James stood behind her, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder, unaware that their simple act of kindness was about to set in motion events that would change their lives forever. "Do you think she'll like them, Daddy?" Melody asked, her breath fogging the glass. "Anyone would be lucky to receive such a thoughtful gift," James assured her, though something in his expression suggested concern. He'd lived in this neighborhood long enough to know that sometimes the simplest actions could have the most complicated consequences. The rain continued to fall, casting a gray veil over Maple Avenue, while in the shadows, a phone call was being made, one that would transform a child's innocent gesture into something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The rain had intensified, drumming against the pavement of Maple Avenue with increasing urgency. The package Melody had left still sat on Mrs. Greenwood's porch, its cheerful wrapping growing damp in the gathering storm. The silence of the afternoon was suddenly broken by the distinctive sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. A black and white police cruiser rounded the corner, its lights flashing but siren now silent, casting eerie red and blue shadows across the wet streets. Officer Mike Davidson pulled up to the curb in front of Mrs. Greenwood's Victorian house, followed closely by his partner, Officer Sarah Chun. They'd received an urgent call about suspicious activity, possibly related to the recent string of burglaries targeting elderly residents. Dispatch said the suspect was seen approaching the house approximately 10 minutes ago, Officer Chin said, checking her notes. Apparently left some kind of package on the porch. Through the increasing rain, curious faces began appearing in windows up and down the street. Martha Wilson, who lived next door to Mrs. Greenwood, was the first to emerge onto her porch, clutching her housecoat tightly around her. "I saw the whole thing," she called out to the officers, hurrying down her steps despite the rain. A little girl in a yellow raincoat. She snuck up to Eleanor's porch, left something, and ran away. More neighbors began emerging from their homes, gathering in small clusters under umbrellas, their whispered conversations creating a low buzz of speculation. Among them was Howard Carter, a tall man with graying hair who'd lived on the street for over 3 decades. He stood apart from the others, his arms crossed and expression stern. "It was the Thompson girl," Carter announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "That nurse's daughter. I've been saying for months they're trouble. Always skulking around. That child drawing pictures of people's houses." Officer Davidson approached the porch carefully, his hand resting instinctively on his weapon. The package sat innocuously on the welcome mat, water beginning to seep into its decorative paper. Officer Chin followed close behind with a flashlight, illuminating the small box. "Mrs. Greenwood?" Officer Davidson called out, knocking firmly on the door. "This is the police. We've received a report about a suspicious package left at your residence." The old Victorian house remained silent for a moment. Then curtains rustled in the front window. The door opened slowly, revealing Eleanor Greenwood, a thin woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her face showed confusion and alarm as she peered out at the gathering crowd. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't call anyone." "Ma'am, someone reported suspicious activity at your house," Officer Chin explained gently. "There's a package here. Did you see who left it?" Mrs. Greenwood's eyes darted to the colorful box on her porch, then to the neighbors gathered on the street. "No, I've been feeling unsafe lately. There have been break-ins, you know. I've been keeping my curtains drawn." Officer Davidson knelt down to examine the package while his partner continued speaking with Mrs. Greenwood. He carefully lifted it, noting how light it was, and gently unwrapped the damp paper. Inside, he found a hand-painted card decorated with glitter and a box containing what appeared to be homemade cookies. "Ma'am," he said, holding up the card, "it appears to be a child's artwork. There's a message here that says, 'Thank you for Snowball.'" Mrs. Greenwood's expression shifted from fear to confusion. "Snowball? The stray cat that's been hanging around?" Meanwhile, just down the street, James Thompson was calling Melody in for dinner, unaware of the commotion unfolding near Mrs. Greenwood's house. The sound of the rain had masked the arrival of the police, and their dining room faced the backyard rather than the street. "Melody, honey, the pasta's getting cold," he called up the stairs. Melody appeared at the top of the stairs, still wearing her rain boots but having changed into dry clothes. She seemed distracted, constantly glancing toward her bedroom window which faced Mrs. Greenwood's house. "Coming, Daddy," she said, making her way down slowly. "I was just finishing another painting." James noticed her unusual quietness as she sat at the table, pushing her spaghetti around her plate rather than eating it. "Everything okay, sweetheart? You're not usually this quiet." "I'm okay," she replied, though her eyes kept drifting toward the window. "Do you think Mrs. Greenwood liked the cookies?" Before James could respond, their doorbell rang. He frowned, not expecting visitors, especially in this weather. "Stay here and eat your dinner," he told Melody, rising to answer the door. Back at Mrs. Greenwood's house, the crowd had grown despite the rain. Howard Carter had positioned himself at the center of a group of neighbors, his voice carrying over the sound of the storm. "First these break-ins start happening, and now suspicious packages," he was saying. "And have you noticed how that Thompson girl is always watching houses, drawing pictures? Probably casing them for her father. I heard he works nights at the hospital. Convenient for burglaries, don't you think?" Martha Wilson nodded eagerly, always ready to embrace a bit of gossip. And did you know they moved here right before the break-in started? Can't be a coincidence. That's enough speculation, Officer Chen interrupted firmly, having overheard the conversation. This appears to be nothing more than a child's gift. We'll handle the investigation. But the damage was already done. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire, theories growing more outlandish with each retelling. Some neighbors began to recall suspicious behavior they'd previously thought nothing of: Melody's habit of drawing houses, James's irregular hours, the times they'd seen the little girl near various properties. Mrs. Greenwood stood in her doorway, holding the now unwrapped package in her hands. The cookies were still warm, she noticed, and the card was beautifully painted with an image of Snowball sitting in her window. Something about the innocent gesture made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Ma'am," Officer Davidson said, "would you like us to confiscate the package? We can have it tested." "No," Mrs. Greenwood said quietly, surprising herself. "No, I'd like to keep it." The rain continued to fall as the police began wrapping up their investigation. Officer Chen was taking statements from neighbors, while Officer Davidson made notes about the incident. The crowd slowly began to disperse, though small groups lingered under umbrellas, continuing their discussions in hushed tones. Howard Carter remained, watching Mrs. Greenwood's house with an unreadable expression. He pulled out his phone, appeared to check something, then walked away with a satisfied look on his face. Inside her house, Mrs. Greenwood sat in her faded armchair, the package resting on her lap. Snowball had appeared from wherever he'd been hiding during the commotion, rubbing against her legs and purring. She picked up the card again, studying the careful brushstrokes that had created his image. The cookies smelled like childhood and simpler times, reminding her of Sunday afternoons in her mother's kitchen. Yet something held her back from tasting them, a lifetime of caution, perhaps, or the whispers of suspicion that had filtered through her windows with the rain. Through her front window, she could see the police car finally pulling away, its lights no longer flashing, but still reflecting off the wet pavement. The street was almost empty now, the excitement of the afternoon fading with the daylight. But something had changed in the atmosphere of Maple Avenue. An invisible line had been drawn, divisions deepened, suspicions planted. Mrs. Greenwood looked down at the card again, tracing the words, "Thank you for Snowball," with a trembling finger. Her expression remained unreadable as she sat in her darkening living room, the sound of rain her only company. Snowball jumped on her lap, settling himself next to the box of cookies, and began to purr. In the growing darkness, she sat perfectly still, torn between decades of isolation and the simple, unexpected kindness of a child she'd never met. Outside, the storm continued, washing away the last traces of the afternoon's events, but the ripples of what had happened would continue to spread through the neighborhood, touching lives in ways no one could yet imagine. The package sat on her lap, both a gift and a question, while somewhere down the street, a little girl in yellow rain boots wondered if she'd done something wrong by trying to do something right. The night settled over Maple Avenue like a heavy blanket, but sleep would be elusive for many of its residents, their minds troubled by the afternoon's events and the questions that remained unanswered. Mrs. Greenwood's eyes remained fixed on the card, her expression still impossible to read, as the last police car's taillights disappeared around the corner, leaving the street in darkness broken only by the gentle glow of porch lights and the persistent drumming of the rain. The morning after the incident dawned clear and bright, the storm clouds having departed overnight, leaving puddles that reflected the autumn sun like scattered mirrors. Melody sat in Ms. Parker's third-grade class, trying to focus on her multiplication tables, but her mind kept wandering to Mrs. Greenwood's house and the package she'd left. The classroom intercom crackled to life, startling everyone. "Ms. Parker, please send Melody Thompson to the principal's office. She should bring her things." A collective "oh" rippled through the classroom, the universal sound of elementary school students when someone gets called to the office. Melody's stomach tightened as she gathered her backpack, her classmates' eyes following her to the door. "It's probably nothing to worry about," Ms. Parker whispered encouragingly as Melody passed her desk, but something in her teacher's expression suggested otherwise. The walk to Principal Watson's office felt longer than usual. Through the administrative office windows, Melody could see her father's car in the parking lot, and her heart began to race. As she approached the office, She heard raised voices through the door. "She's 8 years old, for heaven's sake." That was her father's voice, angry in a way she rarely heard. Principal Watson's secretary, Mrs. Bryant, gave Melody a sympathetic smile and gestured toward the door. "They're waiting for you, dear." Inside the office, Melody found her father standing with his arms crossed, facing Principal Watson and 2 police officers. Officer Chun from yesterday, and a tall man she didn't recognize, who introduced himself as Detective Roberts. "Hello, Melody," Principal Watson said, her voice gentler than usual. "Please, have a seat. These officers would like to ask you a few questions." Melody sat in one of the large chairs, her feet barely touching the ground. James immediately moved to stand behind her, placing his hands protectively on her shoulders. Detective Roberts pulled up a chair to sit across from her, trying to appear friendly but maintaining an official demeanor. "Melody, we need to talk about what happened yesterday at Mrs. Greenwood's house. Can you tell me why you left that package?" Melody glanced up at her father, who nodded encouragingly. I made cookies and a card for Mrs. Greenwood," she said quietly. "Because of Snowball." "Snowball?" Detective Roberts asked, making notes. "The white cat that lives there. He comes to play with me, sometimes when I walk by. I wanted to thank Mrs. Greenwood for letting me play with him." Melody's voice grew stronger as she explained. She looked lonely, like Snowball was her only friend. "I thought maybe she'd like cookies too." Officer Chin's expression softened slightly, but Detective Roberts maintained his stern demeanor. "Did you know that Mrs. Greenwood has reported feeling threatened lately? That there have been break-ins in the neighborhood?" "I didn't break in," Melody protested, her eyes filling with tears. "I just left cookies." James's hands tightened on her shoulders. "This is ridiculous. You're interrogating an 8-year-old about cookies? Would we even be having this conversation if she was white?" The room fell silent. Principal Watson shifted uncomfortably in her chair, while Officer Chin looked down at her notepad. Detective Roberts straightened in his chair. "Mr. Thompson, we have to investigate all suspicious activity, given the recent crimes in the area," he said firmly. "Suspicious activity?" James's voice rose. "My daughter made cookies and drew a picture. The only reason this is suspicious is because of the color of her skin. Let me guess. Howard Carter made that anonymous call, didn't he?" Meanwhile, across town at the police station, Mrs. Greenwood sat in an interview room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked smaller somehow, drawn in on herself, as Officer Davidson asked her questions. "Can you walk us through what happened yesterday, Mrs. Greenwood?" he asked gently. I heard a knock," she began hesitantly. "I've been so nervous lately with all the break-ins. I didn't answer right away. Then the police came, saying someone had left something suspicious. And you didn't recognize the gesture as innocent? A child's gift?" Mrs. Greenwood's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what to think anymore. Ever since Harold disappeared, I just stay inside mostly. The neighborhood's changed so much. I don't know my neighbors like I used to." Back at the school, the interview with Melody continued, though James's accusation of racial profiling had changed the atmosphere in the room. "Melody," Officer Chin said, taking over from Detective Roberts, "can you tell me about your drawings? Some neighbors mentioned seeing you drawing their houses." Melody's face lit up slightly. "I love drawing. Miss Parker says I might be an artist someday like my mom was. I draw everything I see. Houses, trees, people, animals." She reached in her backpack and pulled out her sketchbook, filled with colorful drawings of the neighborhood. Mrs. Rodriguez watering her garden, Mr. Lee walking his dog, and yes, several detailed drawings of the houses on Maple Avenue, including Mrs. Greenwood's Victorian home with Snowball in the window. Principal Watson leaned forward to look at the drawings. "These are remarkable, Melody. We actually have some of your artwork hanging in the school hallway." Detective Roberts examined the sketchbook with a frown. "And you've never used these drawings to help anyone plan anything?" "That's enough," James exploded. "My daughter is not a criminal mastermind casing houses through art. She's a little girl who loves to draw and wanted to do something nice for a lonely neighbor. The fact that we're even having this conversation is proof of exactly what's wrong with this neighborhood." Outside the principal's office, word had spread quickly about what was happening. Teachers spoke in hushed voices during their breaks, while parents arriving for various reasons found themselves taking sides in the growing controversy. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had come to drop off medication for her son, defended Melody vigorously to anyone who would listen. That child brings me beautiful cards every week. She helps me with my gardens and never asks for anything in return. This is madness. But others, particularly those who'd lived in the neighborhood longer, were less supportive. You have to admit, it's suspicious, Martha Wilson was saying to a group of parents. All these break-ins starting right after they moved in. The division in the community was becoming more apparent by the hour. Lines were being drawn between those who saw an innocent child's gesture of kindness and those who'd allowed fear and prejudice to color their perception of events. Finally, after what felt like hours, the interview at the school concluded. Detective Roberts stood, gathering his notes. We'll be continuing our investigation, but for now, Melody is free to return to class. Investigation? James questioned incredulously. Into what? Unauthorized cookie delivery. Principal Watson stepped in quickly. Perhaps Melody should take the rest of the day off, Mr. Thompson. Give everyone a chance to cool down. In the car ride home, Melody sat quietly in the back seat, clutching her sketchbook. James kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, his heart breaking at the sight of his normally cheerful daughter looking so defeated. Daddy, she finally said in a small voice. Did I do something bad? James pulled the car over, turning to face his daughter. No, baby. You did something kind and beautiful. Some people just have trouble seeing beauty when it comes in a package they're not expecting. I just wanted to make her happy, Melody sniffled. She always looks so sad when I see her through the window, and Snowball is her only friend. Nobody should only have one friend. James reached back to squeeze her hand. I know, sweetheart. I know. That evening, after putting Melody to bed, James sat at their kitchen table, spreading out newspapers from the past few months. Articles about the break-ins, police reports, community meeting minutes. Anything that might help him understand what was really going on in their neighborhood. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rodriguez. Just heard what happened at school. This isn't right, James. Let me know how I can help. As he read through the articles, a pattern began to emerge. The break-ins had started before they moved to the neighborhood, but they'd increased in frequency recently. And they seemed to be targeting specific houses, all older residents, all living alone. James's nursing training had taught him to look for patterns, to question coincidences. Something about this situation wasn't adding up, and he was determined to find out what it was. His daughter's tears had awakened something in him, a determination to not just clear her name, but to expose whatever was really happening on Maple Avenue. In her bed upstairs, Melody lay awake, listening to her father moving around downstairs. She pulled out her sketchbook and began a new drawing. This one showing the whole neighborhood, every house, every neighbor, all connected by the streets that ran between them. In her child's mind, she couldn't understand why lines were being drawn between people who lived so close together. As the night deepened, different scenes played out across Maple Avenue. Mrs. Greenwood sat in her darkened living room, the box of cookies still untouched on her coffee table, while Snowball purred in her lap. Howard Carter made another mysterious phone call from his study. Officer Chin reviewed her notes from the day, a troubled expression on her face. And in the Thompson house, a father and daughter lay awake in their beds, both hurting from the day's events, both wondering how a simple act of kindness had turned into something so complicated. But while Melody's young heart was heavy with confusion and sadness, James's mind was racing with determination. Someone had deliberately twisted his daughter's innocent gesture into something sinister, and he was going to find out why. The moon rose over Maple Avenue, its light touching each house equally, ignorant of the invisible lines that now divided the neighborhood. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new accusations, new revelations. But for now, the street was quiet, holding its secrets close, waiting for the truth to emerge from the shadows of prejudice and fear. The early morning light barely penetrated the thick fog that had settled over Maple Avenue. James Thompson sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by newspaper clippings, printouts from community Facebook groups, and notes from his conversations with neighbors. He'd taken a rare day off from the hospital, determined to get to the bottom of what was happening. His cell phone buzzed, a text from Officer Sarah Chun. Found something you should know. Can we meet? Somewhere private. James glanced up at the ceiling, where Melody was still asleep. Mrs. Rodriguez had agreed to watch her after school today, giving him time to investigate. He texted back quickly. Coffee shop on 5th Street, 9 a.m.? An hour later, James sat in a corner booth at Bean there, done that, nursing his second cup of coffee. Officer Chin arrived in civilian clothes, looking around carefully before sliding into the seat across from him. I shouldn't be doing this, she said quietly, pulling out her phone, but something about this case doesn't sit right with me. I pulled the records of the 911 call from the cookie incident. Listen. She pressed play, and Howard Carter's distinctive voice filled their corner of the cafe. Yes, I'd like to report suspicious activity at 1242 Maple Avenue. There's someone attempting to deliver what appears to be a package to Eleanor Greenwood's house. Given the recent break-ins targeting elderly residents, I thought it prudent to report. James's hands clenched around his coffee cup. I knew it was him. What you might not know is that Carter has a history of this sort of thing. 3 years ago, he tried to start a petition to prevent a black family from buying the house on Oak Street. 5 years before that, he made complaints about the Hispanic family who opened the grocery store on the corner. Officer Chin nodded grimly. I did some digging. He's made 17 suspicious activity reports in the past 2 years. Every single one involved a person of color. Back on Maple Avenue, Mrs. Greenwood's Victorian house stood silent and dark, despite the morning sun. All the curtains were drawn tight, and a "No Solicitors" sign had appeared on the front door. The morning paper lay untouched on her front steps, along with 2 days' worth of mail. Martha Wilson stood on her own porch next door, speaking in hushed tones with another neighbor. She hasn't come out in days. Won't answer the door, won't answer her phone. I tried bringing her some soup yesterday, but she just called through the door that she wasn't feeling well. Meanwhile, Melody had woken up and was getting ready for school, her movements lacking their usual energy. She paused at her bedroom window, looking out at Mrs. Greenwood's house as she did every morning. But today something was different. Daddy, she called out, running downstairs in her half-buttoned school uniform. Daddy, Snowball's gone. What do you mean, honey? James asked, quickly hiding the investigation materials. He always sits in the window in the morning, but he hasn't been there for 2 days now. What if something happened to him? Melody's eyes filled with tears. What if he's lost or hurt? James hugged his daughter close. I'm sure he's fine, sweetheart. Maybe Mrs. Greenwood is just keeping him inside. But as they left for school that morning, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The street felt different, tenser, more hostile. Mrs. Rodriguez waved from her garden as they passed, but others quickly turned away or hurried inside their houses. That night, after tucking Melody into bed, James sat in their darkened living room, reviewing his notes. Around midnight, he noticed a car he didn't recognize idling across the street. Its headlights were off, but he could see the dim glow of a cell phone illuminating the driver's face. James watched through the curtains as the car sat there for nearly an hour before finally driving away. He wrote down what he could see of the license plate number, adding it to his growing collection of suspicious details. The next morning, he found their garbage cans overturned, trash strewn across their front yard. As he cleaned up the mess, Howard Carter emerged from his house next door, watching with poorly concealed satisfaction. Raccoons, Carter called out, his voice dripping with false concern. They've been a real problem lately. Though I suppose some people might say it's racist to blame the raccoons without proof. James straightened up slowly, trash bag in hand. The past few days of investigation had left him exhausted and angry, and Carter's smug expression was the final straw. Why did you do it, Howard? He asked, his voice carrying across the pristine lawn that separated their properties. Why did you call the police on an 8-year-old girl? Carter's expression hardened. I was performing my civic duty. There have been break-ins. Break-ins that started long before we moved here, James interrupted, walking closer. Break-ins that somehow only target certain houses. Tell me, Howard, did you call the police when Mrs. Peterson's granddaughter delivered cookies last month? Or when the Boy Scouts came around selling popcorn? That was different, Carter sputtered. Those were organized groups. The only difference, James said, now standing directly in front of Carter, is that those children were white. You saw my daughter, a little black girl, approaching a white woman's house, and you immediately assumed the worst. You took an innocent act of kindness and turned it into something ugly, because that's what you wanted to see. Carter's face flushed red. Now see here, Thompson. I won't stand here and be accused of racism in my own front yard. I made that call because I was concerned for Eleanor's safety, nothing more. If you want to make this about race, that's your problem, not mine. You're right about one thing, James replied coldly. This is about safety, but not Mrs. Greenwood's. It's about my daughter's safety. The safety you put at risk when you called armed police officers to confront a child holding cookies and a drawing. Inside the house, Melody sat at the top of the stairs, listening to the confrontation through an open window. Her fingers worked busily with colored pencils as she drew, creating another card, this one showing Snowball playing in Mrs. Greenwood's garden, surrounded by flowers and butterflies. She knew her father had forbidden her from going near Mrs. Greenwood's house again, but surely another card wouldn't hurt? Maybe if she explained about Snowball, about how she just wanted to be friends. Later that afternoon, as James spoke on the phone in his study, Melody crept closer to listen. He was talking to someone named David, his voice urgent and confused. It doesn't make sense, Dave. Why would a development company be interested in a lawsuit from 20 years ago? And what does it have to do with Harold Greenwood's disappearance? Melody didn't understand most of what she heard, but she caught phrases that made her curious. Property values, mysterious accident, and signed contracts. Her father sounded worried, which made her worry too. As night fell over Maple Avenue, Melody lay in bed, unable to sleep. She kept thinking about Snowball alone somewhere in the dark. Her new card sat on her desk, ready to be delivered, but she knew her father would never allow it. Through her window, she could see Mrs. Greenwood's house, dark except for a single light in an upstairs window. The fog had returned, wrapping the Victorian building in ghostly shadows. Somewhere in that house was the answer to what happened to Snowball, and maybe to all the other strange things happening in the neighborhood. Melody glanced at her bedside clock, 11:23 p.m. Her father would be asleep by now, exhausted from his day of investigation. She could hear his soft snoring from down the hall. Quietly, she slipped out of bed and pulled on her shoes. She grabbed her flashlight, the new card, and her warmest sweater. The wooden stairs creaked slightly as she descended, but her father's snoring continued undisturbed. The night air was cool and damp as Melody carefully opened the back door, closing it silently behind her. The fog had thickened, making the familiar shapes of her neighborhood look strange and mysterious. Somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed, making her jump. She made her way through the shadows, staying close to the hedges and trees that lined the street. Mrs. Greenwood's house loomed ahead, looking more imposing than ever in the darkness. The single upstairs light had gone out, but Melody thought she could see movement behind one of the downstairs curtains. As she crept closer to the house, a familiar sound made her heart leap, a soft meow coming from somewhere near Mrs. Greenwood's backyard. Melody hesitated, looking back toward her house, then forward again toward the sound. "Snowball," she whispered into the darkness. "Is that you?" Another meow answered her, clearer this time. Taking a deep breath, Melody stepped off the sidewalk and into the shadows of Mrs. Greenwood's property, unaware that she wasn't the only one moving through the fog-shrouded night. Behind her, the same car that had been watching their house earlier rolled silently down the street, its headlights off. And in an upstairs window of Howard Carter's house, a figure stood watching, phone in hand, as Melody disappeared into the misty darkness. The fog swallowed her small figure as she moved toward the sound of Snowball's cries, the beam of her flashlight creating eerie shapes in the mist. The ancient Victorian house seemed to loom larger with each step she took, its windows like watchful eyes in the night. Somewhere in the distance, a clock began to strike midnight, its chimes muffled by the thick fog. Melody clutched her flashlight tighter and pressed forward, unaware that her innocent search for a missing cat was about to uncover secrets that would shake Maple Avenue to its foundation. The night held its breath as Melody ventured deeper into the shadows, while all around her, unseen eyes watched and waited. In her pocket, the card she'd made seemed to burn with urgency, a child's simple message of friendship about to collide with adult conspiracies and long-buried truths. Above her, the fog parted briefly, revealing a sliver of moon that cast just enough light to illuminate the path ahead. Melody took another step forward, then another, following the sound of Snowball's increasingly urgent meows. Whatever she was about to discover in Mrs. Greenwood's backyard, there would be no turning back now. The night air grew colder as Melody moved deeper into the property, the fog wrapping around her like a thick blanket. The familiar shapes of her neighborhood had disappeared entirely, leaving her in a world of shadows and whispers. Yet still she pressed on, driven by the kind of determination that only children possess, the unwavering belief that doing the right thing, no matter how scary, is always worth it. In her house, Mrs. Greenwood sat in her darkened living room, unaware of the small figure moving through her garden. The untouched cookies still sat on her coffee table, a silent reminder of how an act of kindness had somehow turned her quiet life upside down. Snowball's continued cries from outside made her hands tremble as she reached for her phone, uncertain whether to call for help or simply wait for morning. And in his bed, James Thompson shifted restlessly, his dreams filled with mysterious lawsuits and shadowy figures, unaware that his daughter was about to stumble upon the very answers he'd been searching for. The fog continued to thicken outside, as if nature itself was trying to hide the secrets that Maple Avenue had kept buried for so long. The fog grew thicker as Melody crept through Mrs. Greenwood's overgrown backyard, following the increasingly urgent sounds of Snowball's meows. Her flashlight beam cut through the mist, creating eerie shadows among the untended rose bushes and weather-worn garden statues. "Snowball," she whispered, her heart pounding. "Where are you?" Another plaintive cry guided her toward a dilapidated garden shed at the far end of the yard. As she approached, her flashlight beam caught a glint of metal behind the structure. There, partially hidden by overgrown ivy, stood a small wire cage. Inside, Snowball paced anxiously, his white fur dirty and matted. "Oh no," Melody gasped, rushing forward. "Who did this to you?" The cage was secured with a simple latch, not even locked. Melody's small fingers worked quickly to release it, her hands trembling with both fear and anger. Who would lock up such a friendly cat? As soon as the door swung open, Snowball darted out, but instead of running away, he rubbed against Melody's legs, purring loudly. She knelt down to scratch behind his ears, noticing how thin he felt beneath his thick fur. Suddenly, a light flicked on inside the house, spilling yellow light across the backyard. Melody quickly ducked behind the shed, pulling Snowball close. Through a gap in the weatherboards, she could see Mrs. Greenwood pacing in what appeared to be her kitchen, a phone pressed to her ear. "I told you to leave me alone." Mrs. Greenwood's voice carried clearly through the night air, trembling with fear and anger. "I'm not selling the house. Not now, not ever." Melody held her breath, watching as the elderly woman ran a shaking hand through her silver hair. "Don't you dare threaten me," Mrs. Greenwood continued. "Harold may be gone, but I know what you did. No, don't tell me it was an accident. 20 years of accidents? I'm not a fool." There was a long pause as Mrs. Greenwood listened to whoever was on the other end of the call. Her face, visible in profile through the kitchen window, grew paler. The break-ins, the threatening notes, now this business with the little girl's cookies. "I know it's all connected. You're trying to scare me out of my home, just like you did to the Hendersons and the Wilsons." "Yes, I know about them too." Melody's mind raced. The cookies? What did her gift have to do with any of this? She thought about Mr. Carter's suspicious behavior, the strange car that kept appearing on their street, and now Snowball locked in a cage. Nothing made sense, yet somehow it all seemed connected. Mrs. Greenwood's voice rose again. "I have copies of everything. Harold's notes, the photographs, the contracts. You think I don't know why my husband disappeared? He was going to expose your whole operation." Snowball shifted in Melody's arms, letting out a small meow. She quickly covered his mouth with her hand, her heart pounding as Mrs. Greenwood turned toward the window. "I have to go," Mrs. Greenwood said suddenly. "Someone's out there." "No, don't you dare send anyone to check on me. I mean it. Leave me alone." Melody waited until the kitchen light went out before making her move. Clutching Snowball tightly, she crept along the edge of the property, keeping to the shadows until she reached the street. Then she ran, her feet barely touching the ground, all the way home. But as she approached her house, her heart sank. Every light was on, and she could see her father's silhouette pacing in the living room window. "Melody Rose Thompson." James's voice boomed as soon as she opened the door. "Do you have any idea what time it is? I've been out of my mind with worry." Melody stood in the doorway, still holding Snowball, who had begun to purr contentedly. "Daddy, I can explain. Do you know I was about to call the police? After everything that's happened, how could you sneak out like this?" James ran his hands over his face, his anger warring with relief. Then he noticed the cat. "Is that?" "Someone locked him in a cage," Melody said quickly, the words tumbling out. "Behind Mrs. Greenwood's shed. And Daddy, I heard her on the phone. She's scared of something, but not because of me. She said something about her husband and accidents and people trying to make her sell her house." James's expression shifted from anger to concern. He knelt down to examine Snowball, his medical training taking over. "He's dehydrated," he muttered, then looked up at his daughter. "Tell me everything you heard. Don't leave anything out." As Melody recounted Mrs. Greenwood's phone conversation, James's frown deepened. He got up and retrieved his laptop, opening files of research he'd been collecting. "Listen to this," he said, pulling up a news article from 20 years ago. "Harold Greenwood, local real estate attorney, disappeared while investigating claims of fraud against Crown Development Corporation. His car was found at the bottom of Miller's Lake, but his body was never recovered." "The same company that's trying to buy Mrs. Rodriguez's house?" Melody asked, remembering the for sale sign that had appeared in her friend's yard last week. James nodded grimly. "And the Hendersons' house before they moved away, and the Wilsons' house before them. They've been buying up properties all over the neighborhood, but Mrs. Greenwood won't sell because she knows they did something to her husband." Melody hugged Snowball closer. "I think so, honey, and I think someone's been trying to scare her into selling. The break-ins, the threatening phone calls." He paused, looking at his daughter. "They might have even used my little girl's act of kindness to make her feel more vulnerable." Melody's eyes filled with tears. "I just wanted to be nice. I didn't mean to make things worse." James pulled her into a tight hug, careful not to squish Snowball. "You didn't make things worse, sweetheart. You may have actually helped uncover what's really going on here. But you can't ever sneak out like that again, understand? It's not safe." Melody nodded against his chest. "Can we help Mrs. Greenwood?" "We'll try, baby. But first, you need to get to bed. And we need to figure out what to do with this guy." He scratched Snowball behind the ears. "He can stay with us, just until Mrs. Greenwood feels safe again." James sighed, knowing he'd already lost this battle. "Go get him some water and that leftover chicken from dinner. But this discussion about sneaking out isn't over, young lady." The next morning, as Melody got ready for school, she couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Greenwood. She pulled out her art supplies and began working on a new card. "Dear Mrs. Greenwood," she wrote carefully, "I'm sorry if my cookies scared you. I just wanted to be your friend. I found Snowball, and he's safe with us. He misses you, and I think you must miss him too. You don't have to be scared. My daddy helps people at the hospital, and maybe he can help you too. Love, Melody." Meanwhile, James prepared to leave for his morning shift at the hospital. As he backed out of the driveway, he noticed a dark sedan parked down the street. The same car he'd seen watching their house before. This time, when he turned onto Oak Street, the sedan pulled out and began following him. James took a series of random turns, confirming his suspicions. The car was definitely tailing him. He pulled out his phone at a stoplight, quickly dialing Officer Chun. "Sarah? That car you asked me to watch for? It's behind me right now. License plate matching the one from the other break-ins. Stay on the main roads," Officer Chun instructed. "I'm sending a patrol car your way." But before the patrol car could arrive, James's follower apparently realized they'd been made. The sedan turned abruptly down a side street and disappeared. Back on Maple Avenue, Mrs. Greenwood sat in her living room, still clutching her phone from the previous night's threatening call. Snowball's absence weighed heavily on her heart. She hadn't meant to neglect him, but lately she'd been too afraid to even step outside to feed him properly. The doorbell rang, making her jump. Through the peephole, she could see it was just the mail carrier, but she waited until they'd walked away before opening the door. Among the usual bills and junk mail was a hand-addressed envelope from a law firm. Her hand shook as she opened it, reading the formal notice inside. Another offer from Crown Development, this one including thinly veiled references to her recent security concerns and suggesting that selling might be in her best interest. The sound of breaking glass shattered the morning quiet. Mrs. Greenwood ran to her kitchen, following the noise, and froze. The back door's window had been smashed, and through the broken pane, she could see a dark figure disappearing into the fog that still hadn't lifted from her overgrown garden. On her kitchen table lay a single playing card, the ace of spades. The same calling card that had been left at every other break-in in the neighborhood. But this time, something was different. The burglar had left something else. A faded photograph that made Mrs. Greenwood's blood run cold. It showed Harold, her husband, standing in front of Miller's Lake, his arm around a much younger Eleanor. Scrawled across the image in red ink were the words, "Accidents can happen twice." Mrs. Greenwood's scream echoed across Maple Avenue, setting off a chain of events that would finally bring all the shadowy pieces of the puzzle into the light. The fog began to lift, but the darkness that had been haunting their neighborhood was far from over. In his classroom at the hospital where he taught nursing students, James's phone buzzed with multiple messages. From Officer Chun, break-in reported at Greenwood House. You need to see this. From Mrs. Rodriguez, James, something's happening at Eleanor's. Police everywhere. From his neighbor across the street, strange men watching your house. Should I call 911? And finally, from Melody's school, Mr. Thompson, your daughter is quite upset about something she saw on her way to class. Please call us immediately. James grabbed his keys. His research about Harold Greenwood and Crown Development scattered across his desk. As he rushed to his car, the dark sedan appeared again, this time making no attempt to hide. The driver, a man in a dark suit, smiled coldly and held up a playing card, the ace of spades. The pieces were finally coming together, but time was running out. Whatever had happened to Harold Greenwood 20 years ago, whatever secrets lay buried in the history of their troubled neighborhood, it was all rushing toward a conclusion that would change Maple Avenue forever. And somewhere in the middle of it all was an 8-year-old girl whose simple act of kindness had unknowingly set everything in motion. James Thompson's tires screeched as he turned onto Maple Avenue, his heart pounding at the sight of 3 police cars parked in front of Mrs. Greenwood's Victorian house. Their flashing lights cut through the lingering morning fog, casting alternating red and blue shadows across the gathered crowd of neighbors. He'd left the hospital so quickly after receiving the calls that he was still wearing his scrubs. As he parked his car, he could see Officer Chun directing other officers around the property. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze, marking off Mrs. Greenwood's yard from the growing number of onlookers. "James!" Mrs. Rodriguez called out, hurrying over from her position near the front of the crowd. "Thank goodness you're here." They found Eleanor's back door smashed in, and she's absolutely beside herself. "Has she talked to anyone?" James asked, scanning the scene for any sign of the dark sedan that had been following him earlier. "That's just it. She won't speak to anyone except the police. She shut herself in her living room with Detective Roberts and some young officer I haven't seen before." Through the front windows, James could see Mrs. Greenwood sitting rigidly in her armchair, her face pale and drawn. Detective Roberts stood nearby, taking notes, while a younger officer, presumably the one Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned, knelt beside Mrs. Greenwood's chair, speaking to her quietly. "Excuse me, sir, this is an active crime scene," an officer called out as James approached the yellow tape. "I'll need you to stay back with the others." "James Thompson." Officer Chin appeared at his side. "Let him through, Johnson. He might be able to help with this." As James ducked under the tape, he could hear the whispers from the crowd behind him. Howard Carter's voice carried above the others. Well, look who's suddenly involved." Quite a coincidence, don't you think? Inside the house, the atmosphere was tense. Mrs. Greenwood sat clutching a photograph in her trembling hands, while the young officer, his nameplate reading Reynolds, offered her a glass of water. "Mrs. Greenwood," Officer Reynolds said gently, "we need to know if you recognize anyone in that photograph besides your husband." "I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't talk about this with everyone watching. Please, make them all go away." Detective Roberts nodded to another officer, who began clearing the rubbernecking neighbors from the front yard. James noticed that Howard Carter seemed particularly reluctant to leave, his eyes fixed on the broken kitchen window before finally turning away. "Mr. Thompson," Officer Reynolds called out, "could you join us for a moment?" James approached carefully, noting how Mrs. Greenwood tensed at his presence. "Mrs. Greenwood, I know you're scared, but I think I might be able to help. My daughter Melody—" "Please," Mrs. Greenwood interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to discuss your daughter. I just want everyone to leave me alone." Officer Reynolds gave James a meaningful look, then guided him to the kitchen where they could speak privately. The broken glass from the window crunched under their feet. "Listen," Reynolds said in a low voice. "I've been looking into the recent break-ins, and something doesn't add up. They all follow the same pattern. Elderly residents, single occupants, and every victim has received offers from Crown Development within days of the incidents." James nodded. "I've noticed a pattern too, and I think Howard Carter might be involved. He's been watching my house, making threatening comments, and I'm pretty sure he's the one who called the police about Melody's cookies." "Carter?" Reynolds pulled out his notebook. "The name's come up in my investigation. He's been seen meeting with representatives from Crown Development at the diner on 5th Street. But we haven't been able to prove anything concrete." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a sleek black car. A woman in an expensive suit emerged, carrying a leather briefcase. "That's Margaret Wells," Reynolds whispered, "Mrs. Greenwood's lawyer. She's been handling the estate since Harold Greenwood disappeared." Mrs. Wells strode purposefully into the house, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors. "Eleanor? I came as soon as I got your message. Have you shown the police the photograph?" Mrs. Greenwood looked up, her eyes red-rimmed, but clearer now. "Margaret, they were in my house. They left Harold's picture, with a message." The lawyer took the photograph, her professional composure cracking slightly as she read the threatening message scrawled across it. "This changes everything," she said grimly. "Officers, what you're looking at isn't just a break-in. This is part of a systematic campaign of harassment dating back 20 years. James listened intently as Mrs. Wells explained how Crown Development had been trying to acquire properties in the neighborhood for decades. Harold Greenwood, as a real estate attorney, had discovered irregularities in their practices. Properties mysteriously devalued, elderly residents pressured to sell, accidents that seemed too convenient to be coincidental. "The day Harold disappeared," Mrs. Wells continued, "he was supposed to meet with me to share evidence of illegal activities. He never made it to that meeting." Meanwhile, across town at Maple Avenue Elementary, Melody sat at her desk, unable to focus on her mathematics lesson. Her thoughts kept drifting to Mrs. Greenwood, to Snowball, currently being spoiled with tuna by Mrs. Rodriguez, and to the frightening conversation she'd overheard the night before. During recess, instead of playing with her friends, she sat under her favorite oak tree and pulled out her art supplies. She'd been working on something special, not just a card this time, but a full letter with illustrations. "Dear Mrs. Greenwood," she wrote, carefully decorating the margins with tiny flowers and cats. "I'm sorry if I scared you with my cookies and card. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I just saw you looking sad through your window sometimes, and I know how it feels to be lonely. After my mom died, Daddy and I were lonely too, until we moved here and met nice people like Mrs. Rodriguez and Snowball. I heard you on the phone last night, and I know you're scared of something much bigger than cookies or little girls. Daddy always says that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means doing the right thing even when you are scared. Like when he has to help sick people at the hospital even if they might have something contagious. I found Snowball in that cage, but I didn't tell anyone about it except Daddy because I didn't want to get you in trouble. He's safe at our house now, and Mrs. Rodriguez is helping take care of him. He really misses you. I can tell because he sits in our window looking toward your house, just like he used to do in your window. I draw pictures of everything I see because my mom was an artist, and Daddy says it helps keep her memory alive. I've drawn lots of pictures of your house because it's beautiful, like something from a fairy tale, even if it's a little scary sometimes. I drew some of those pictures for you. One of your house in spring with all the flowers I imagine used to grow there, one of Snowball in his favorite window spot, and one of you and me having tea and cookies together. I hope that one comes true someday. You don't have to be alone and scared. Daddy helps people. It's his job at the hospital, but also just who he is. He would help you too if you let him. And I would really like to be your friend. Love, Melody. P.S. Snowball says hi. Well, he meowed when I read him this letter, so I think that means hi. Back at Mrs. Greenwood's house, the investigation continued. Officer Reynolds had brought in forensics to dust for fingerprints, while Detective Roberts interviewed neighbors. James watched as Howard Carter gave his statement, noting how the man's eyes kept darting toward the broken window. "It's all connected," James said quietly to Officer Reynolds. The break-ins, the pressure to sell, the threatening phone calls. Someone's trying to force Mrs. Greenwood out of her home. They're using everything they can. Even twisted my daughter's act of kindness into something threatening. Reynolds nodded grimly. We've seen this before, developers using intimidation tactics to clear out resistant homeowners. But this case is different. There's something bigger here, something that goes back to Harold Greenwood's disappearance. Inside, Mrs. Greenwood sat with her lawyer, going through a stack of documents. James could hear fragments of their conversation. The original contracts, Harold's notes, proof of certification fraud. Suddenly, Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at the kitchen door, holding something in her hands. Eleanor, I'm sorry to interrupt, but, well, Melody asked me to give you this. She held out the envelope containing Melody's letter. Mrs. Greenwood stared at it for a long moment, then slowly reached out to take it. She's a special child, Eleanor, Mrs. Rodriguez said softly. She sees beauty and friendship where others see only differences and fear. Just like Harold used to do. Mrs. Greenwood's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. As she read Melody's words and looked at the carefully drawn pictures, tears began to roll down her cheeks. The cookies, she whispered. They smell just like the ones my mother used to make. And the card, it was so beautiful. I wanted to thank her, but I was so afraid. She looked up at James, her eyes clearing. Your daughter found Snowball? He's safe? James nodded. She heard him crying behind your shed last night. Someone had locked him in a cage. A cage? Mrs. Greenwood's face darkened. I would never. Howard Carter. He's always hated Snowball. Said he was a nuisance. He must have. She trailed off, realization dawning in her eyes. Mrs. Greenwood, Officer Reynolds said gently, would you be willing to make a formal statement now? About everything. The break-ins, the threats, and Mr. Carter's involvement. Mrs. Greenwood looked down at Melody's letter again, running her fingers over the colorful drawings. Yes, she said finally. Yes, I think it's time to tell the whole story. For Harold, for this neighborhood, and for a little girl who reminded me what it means to be brave. As the afternoon sun began to break through the lingering fog, casting warm light through Mrs. Greenwood's windows, the atmosphere in the house changed. The fear and tension began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of purpose and resolution. Mrs. Greenwood sat straighter in her chair, holding Melody's letter like a talisman as she began to share her story with the officers. Outside, the neighbors gradually dispersed, though Howard Carter lingered at the edge of his property, his face darkening as he watched Mrs. Greenwood talking animatedly with the police. James stepped onto the porch, pulling out his phone to call Mrs. Rodriguez and check on Melody. As he did, he noticed the dark sedan from earlier parked at the far end of the street. But this time, he wasn't afraid. The truth was finally coming to light, and no amount of intimidation could stop it now. Inside her classroom, Melody added the final touches to another drawing. This one showing Mrs. Greenwood's house transformed from a scary Victorian mansion into a warm, welcoming home, with flowers blooming in the garden, Snowball in the window, and two figures on the porch sharing cookies and smiled. The fog had lifted from Maple Avenue, and with it, the shadows of fear and prejudice that had darkened their neighborhood for so long. Change was coming, sparked by a child's simple act of kindness and courage. Late into the evening, James Thompson and Officer Reynolds sat in the small conference room at the police station, surrounded by stacks of documents, property records, and old newspaper clippings. The wall before them had become a web of connections, photos linked by red string, all centered around Crown Development Corporation. Look at this, Officer Reynolds said, holding up a financial document. Howard Carter received monthly payments from a shell company that traces back to Crown Development. Started right after the first wave of break-ins began. James leaned forward, studying the numbers. $10,000 a month? Just to harass his neighbors. More than that. Reynolds pinned another document to the wall. He's been their eyes and ears in the neighborhood for years. Every time someone considers selling, he's there, spreading rumors about crime rates, property values dropping, creating just enough fear to make people consider Crown's lowball offers. But Mrs. Greenwood wouldn't sell. James mused, connecting more pieces in his mind. And she had something they were afraid of, evidence of their illegal activities. The door opened, An officer entered with fresh coffee and a concerned expression. "You need to see this," she said, sliding a thick file folder onto the table. "We pulled Howard Carter's phone records. Guess who he called right before reporting Melody's cookie delivery?" James's hand tightened around his coffee cup as he read the number. "Crown Development's legal department. They used my daughter's kindness as part of their intimidation campaign," he said, his voice tight with anger. "They took something beautiful and twisted it into a weapon." Across town, at Mrs. Greenwood's house, something unexpected was happening. The elderly woman sat in her kitchen with Melody, watching as the little girl helped Snowball adjust to being back home. The cat moved cautiously through the familiar space, as if unsure of his welcome. "He missed you," Melody said, scratching behind Snowball's ears. "He kept looking out our window toward your house." Mrs. Greenwood's eyes filled with tears. "I missed him too. I've been so afraid lately. I stopped letting him in because I was worried they might hurt him to get to me. Who would want to hurt Snowball?" Melody asked, her young face clouding with concern. The elderly woman was quiet for a moment, then seemed to make a decision. "People who want to take my home away. Bad people who hurt my husband a long time ago. Is that why you were scared of my cookies?" Melody asked softly. Mrs. Greenwood reached across the table and took Melody's small hand in her weathered one. "Oh, sweetheart, I wasn't really scared of your cookies. I was scared of everything by then. But your kindness, it reminded me of how things used to be in this neighborhood, before all the fear and suspicion." At the police station, James and Officer Reynolds had made another breakthrough. An old employee of Crown Development had come forward with a devastating confession. Harold Greenwood didn't just disappear, Reynolds read from the statement. He was silenced. He had proof that Crown was using fraudulent permits, falsifying environmental reports, and bribing officials. The night he vanished, he was going to turn everything over to the FBI. James studied the crime scene photos from Harold's supposed accident. The brake lines on his car were cut. They made it look like an accident, but it was murder, Reynolds finished grimly. And now they're trying to force Mrs. Greenwood out before she can expose the truth about what happened. Their investigation was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass and screaming from the street outside. Both men rushed to the window, just in time to see a dark figure running from Howard Carter's house. "I told you I didn't know anything," Carter shouted from his doorway, his face red with fear and anger. "You promised this wouldn't get violent." Officers swarmed the scene, but the figure had vanished into the night. Inside Carter's house, they found evidence of a fierce struggle and a threatening message painted on his living room wall. And oh, loose ends. "They're turning on their own people now," Reynolds observed. "Carter's liability has become too great." Back at Mrs. Greenwood's house, Melody was sharing her art supplies with the elderly woman, teaching her how to mix watercolors to create the perfect shade of blue for Snowball's eyes. The tension of the past weeks had begun to melt away as they worked together, sharing stories and gentle laughter. "You remind me of my granddaughter," Mrs. Greenwood said softly. "She moved away years ago, after everything happened. I haven't seen her since." Before Melody could respond, a brick crashed through the kitchen window, sending glass flying everywhere. Mrs. Greenwood screamed and pulled Melody down, shielding the child with her own body as Snowball darted under the table. Attached to the brick was a note. "Final warning. Sell or join Harold." Melody, despite her fear, stood up straight and declared with all the fierce determination an 8-year-old could muster, "We're your friends now, Mrs. Greenwood. We won't let them hurt you." The elderly woman stared at the little girl in wonder, seeing in her young face the same courage and determination she'd once seen in Harold's. "You know what? You're right. I've been afraid for too long." James arrived minutes later with Officer Reynolds, finding his daughter helping Mrs. Greenwood sweep up broken glass while Snowball watched from his perch on the counter. "That's it," James said firmly. "We're setting a trap. These people have terrorized this neighborhood for the last time." Officer Reynolds nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I've got an idea. Mrs. Greenwood, how would you feel about making Crown Development think they've finally won?" As the night deepened, plans were made. Mrs. Greenwood would announce her intention to sell, drawing Crown's representatives into the open. Officer Reynolds would coordinate with FBI agents who had been investigating the company's activities across the state. "We'll need to make it convincing," Reynolds explained. They'll be suspicious if you suddenly change your mind after all these years. Let them be suspicious, Mrs. Greenwood said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. I'm tired of being afraid. Harold stood up to them. And now it's my turn. Melody, who had been quietly drawing while the adults talked, held up her latest creation. A picture of Mrs. Greenwood's house, surrounded by police cars, with Crown Development's representatives being led away in handcuffs. Is this how it's going to end? She asked hopefully. James smiled at his daughter's optimism, but his eyes were serious as he shared a look with Officer Reynolds. They both knew that cornered predators were the most dangerous. The next few days would require perfect timing and execution if they were going to bring down an organization that had literally gotten away with murder for 20 years. Tomorrow, Reynolds said, checking his weapon, we start writing the ending to this story. And this time, justice won't be denied. As they finalized their plans, none of them noticed the dark sedan sliding past the house, its occupants taking careful note of everyone present. The end game was approaching, but whether it would end in justice or tragedy remained to be seen. The night wrapped around Maple Avenue like a thick blanket, but for the first time in years, Mrs. Greenwood's house glowed with warmth and purpose. Snowball curled up in his favorite window spot. Melody added final touches to her drawing, and the adults prepared for battle. Tomorrow would bring either an end to 20 years of fear and corruption, or James pushed away the alternative. They had truth on their side this time, and the innocent courage of a child who had unknowingly started it all with a simple plate of cookies and a hand-painted card. Officer Reynolds made his final notes, his young face set with determination. Get some rest, he advised. Tomorrow, we turn the hunters into the hunted. The plan was set in motion at dusk. Mrs. Greenwood's Victorian house stood dark and seemingly empty, its windows reflecting the last rays of sunlight. Inside, Officer Reynolds and his team waited silently, their positions carefully chosen to remain hidden from view. James had made sure word got out through the neighborhood grapevine that Mrs. Greenwood had finally agreed to sell her house to Crown Development. The meeting was scheduled for 8 p.m., but they expected their targets to arrive early, probably to plant more evidence or threats. Everyone in position? Reynolds whispered into his radio. Confirmations came back from units stationed around the property. Mrs. Greenwood sat in her kitchen with James, her hands steady as she poured tea. You know, she said quietly, this is the first time in years I haven't felt afraid in my own home. Movement at the back gate, crackled a voice through Reynolds' radio. Two figures approaching. One confirmed as Howard Carter. Through the kitchen window, they could see Carter and a man in a dark suit creeping through the garden. Carter held something in his hands. It looked like a manila envelope. Wait for them to make their move, Reynolds instructed. We need to catch them in the act. The back door's lock clicked softly. Carter apparently had a key. As the door swung open, they could hear the men's whispered conversation. Plant the documents in her study, the suit was saying. Make it look like she's been gathering evidence against the company for years. When we find them during the sale inspection, like we did with Harold? Carter's voice shook slightly. I never agreed to. You agreed when you took the first payment, the suit snapped. Now shut up and do your job. The trap was sprung. Lights blazed on throughout the house, temporarily blinding the intruders. Officers emerged from their hiding spots, weapons drawn. Police, don't move. Carter dropped the envelope, raising his hands immediately. But his companion had other ideas. The suit reached into his jacket, only to find himself tackled by James, who had anticipated such a move. Richard Morton, Officer Reynolds said, reading the man's ID. Crown Development's chief of security. You're under arrest for breaking and entering, conspiracy, and I suspect we'll be adding quite a few more charges once we examine those documents you brought. The envelope Carter had dropped had spilled its contents across the floor. Photographs, contracts, and most damning of all, a detailed record of payments made to community advisors like Carter who had helped pressure residents to sell. As the suspects were led away in handcuffs, more police cars arrived. The commotion had drawn neighbors from their homes, creating a crowd that grew as news spread through the neighborhood. Is that Howard Carter? Martha Wilson gasped, watching her longtime neighbor being placed in a police car. I can't believe it. He always seemed so concerned about property values and neighborhood safety. That's how they operate. Officer Chen explained to the gathered crowd. They create fear and suspicion, turn neighbors against each other, then swoop in to save people by buying their properties at a fraction of their worth. The evidence found in the envelope proved devastating. Crown Development's illegal tactics were exposed in detail, from the fraudulent permits that Harold Greenwood had discovered to the systematic intimidation of elderly residents. Most shocking was a series of photographs showing Harold Greenwood's car being tampered with the night he disappeared. Morton's face was clearly visible in several shots. They kept the evidence, Mrs. Greenwood said, her voice thick with emotion. They kept proof of their own crimes as insurance against each other. The morning newspapers ran the story on their front pages. Corporate corruption exposed in Maple Avenue scandal. The articles detailed how a little girl's act of kindness had inadvertently sparked the investigation that brought down a criminal enterprise. Melody, reading the paper with her father over breakfast, found her own name mentioned. 8-year-old Melody Thompson's gesture of friendship, leaving cookies and a hand-painted card for an elderly neighbor, set in motion a chain of events that exposed 20 years of corporate corruption and criminal activity. "Am I really a hero?" she asked James, her eyes wide. "The best kind," he replied, hugging her close. "The kind that changes the world with kindness instead of fear." At Mrs. Greenwood's house, the transformation was remarkable. Neighbors who had kept their distance for years now stopped by with food, flowers, and offers of help. Mrs. Rodriguez organized a garden cleanup committee, determined to restore the property to its former glory. "I remember when this garden was the pride of the neighborhood," Mrs. Greenwood told Melody as they watched volunteers clearing away years of overgrowth. "Harold used to spend every weekend tending to the roses." Snowball supervised the proceedings from his favorite windowsill, occasionally meowing his approval as sunshine began to reach long-shadowed corners of the garden. Howard Carter's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. His public confession, made in exchange for leniency, revealed the full scope of Crown Development's operations. Other neighborhoods came forward with similar stories, leading to multiple investigations across the state. "I never meant for it to go this far," Carter told investigators. "At first, it was just about the money, but then Harold Greenwood started asking questions, and Morton said we had to protect ourselves." The community's response to the revelations was transformative. A neighborhood that had been divided by suspicion and fear now came together in support of Mrs. Greenwood. The very differences that Crown Development had exploited to create discord became strengths as residents shared their various skills and resources to help restore both the property and the neighborhood spirit. Mrs. Rodriguez organized meals. Mr. Lee, a retired contractor, offered to repair the broken windows and weathered porch. Even Martha Wilson, who had been one of the most suspicious neighbors, volunteered to help sort through years of accumulated paperwork. The culmination came on a bright Saturday afternoon, when the entire neighborhood gathered for a celebration at Mrs. Greenwood's house. The garden, now cleared and replanted, was filled with tables of food, strings of lights, and the sound of children's laughter. Melody had helped organize an art station where neighborhood kids created cards and paintings to decorate Mrs. Greenwood's freshly painted walls. Her own artwork held a place of honor in the living room. The original card that had started everything, framed alongside the newspaper article about the case. "I have an announcement to make," Mrs. Greenwood said, standing on her porch steps with Snowball in her arms. "Thanks to the settlement from Crown Development, I'm establishing the Harold Greenwood Memorial Fund. It will help elderly residents maintain their homes and protect them from predatory developers." The crowd erupted in applause. James noticed Officer Reynolds at the edge of the gathering, smiling as he watched the community he'd helped protect celebrate their victory. "You know," Reynolds said as James approached, "in all my years on the force, I've never seen anything quite like this. Usually, cases like this end with arrests and paperwork. But this is healing." Mrs. Greenwood made her way through the crowd to where Melody sat drawing with other children. "I have something for you," she said, holding out a small box. Inside was a silver charm bracelet. "It was my granddaughter's," Mrs. Greenwood explained. "I've been saving it, waiting for the right person. Someone who understands that real treasure isn't in property values or development deals. It's in the courage to be kind, even when the world isn't kind back." Melody hugged the elderly woman, careful not to disturb Snowball, who had draped himself across both their laps. Around them, the party continued, a symphony of conversations, laughter, and the sounds of a community rediscovering its heart. As the sun began to set, the garden lights twinkled on, creating a magical atmosphere. Children played hide and seek among the newly planted flowers while adults shared stories on the restored porch. The boundaries that had once divided them, race, age, income, seemed to fade away in the warm glow of shared triumph and renewed friendship. "Look, Daddy," Melody said, pointing to her latest drawing. It showed the entire neighborhood gathered around Mrs. Greenwood's house, every face smiling, every hand joined. Above them, a ghostly figure that looked like Harold Greenwood watched over the scene, his expression peaceful. "It's not scary anymore," she explained. "It's just home." James looked around at the transformed community, at Mrs. Greenwood laughing with Mrs. Rodriguez, at former suspicious neighbors now sharing food and stories, at Officer Reynolds playing catch with neighborhood kids. His daughter's simple act of kindness had not only exposed corruption, but had also restored something precious to Maple Avenue, its sense of community. As the celebration continued into the evening, the Victorian house seemed to glow with new life. Its windows, no longer dark with secrets and fear, spilled warm light onto the garden where a neighborhood had rediscovered its soul. The story of the little girl who left cookies for a lonely neighbor would be told for years to come, not just as a tale of justice served, but as a reminder that the strongest weapon against darkness is the simple courage to be kind. The autumn morning brought a gentle warmth to Maple Avenue, the kind that makes leaves dance and carries the scent of ripening apples through the air. Mrs. Greenwood stood in her newly restored garden, watching Melody chase Snowball around the flower beds. The white cat, now sleek and happy again, playfully dodged the little girl's attempts to catch him. "Melody," Mrs. Greenwood called softly, her voice catching slightly. "Could you come here for a moment, dear?" Melody looked up, her face flushed from playing. She had been spending more time at Mrs. Greenwood's house lately, but there was still a hint of shyness in her approach. Mrs. Greenwood sat on the garden bench, patting the space beside her. As Melody settled next to her, Snowball jumped up to join them, purring contentedly. "I owe you an apology," Mrs. Greenwood began, taking Melody's small hand in hers. "When you left those cookies and that beautiful card, I let fear cloud my judgment. I'd been alone for so long, afraid of everything and everyone, that I forgot how to recognize kindness when it was offered." Tears began to roll down the elderly woman's cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Melody. You were trying to be my friend, and I helped turn it into something ugly." Melody squeezed Mrs. Greenwood's hand. "It's okay. Daddy says sometimes people do scared things when they're afraid. Like when I had to get my shots at the doctors and I kicked the nurse." Mrs. Greenwood laughed softly through her tears. "Your father is a wise man. But you know what? You taught me something important. You showed me that being brave doesn't mean never being scared. It means doing kind things even when you are scared." Inside Mrs. Greenwood's house, changes were evident everywhere. The heavy curtains that had once blocked out the world now hung open, allowing sunlight to fill every corner. The walls, once covered in faded wallpaper, now displayed colorful artwork, most of it Melody's creations. "Would you like to learn how to paint with oils?" Mrs. Greenwood asked, leading Melody to a room she'd recently converted into an art studio. "I used to teach art, before everything happened with Harold." Melody's eyes widened at the sight of the easels and art supplies. "Really? You were an art teacher?" "Yes, and I can see you have your mother's talent." Mrs. Greenwood smiled, setting up a small easel. "Your father told me she was an artist too." Over the next few weeks, a routine developed. After school, Melody would come to Mrs. Greenwood's house for art lessons. They would set up their easels in the garden when weather permitted, with Snowball supervising from his perch on the garden wall. James often watched from Mrs. Rodriguez's porch next door, sharing coffee and pan dulce with their neighbor, as they marveled at the transformation of both Mrs. Greenwood and the community. "It's amazing," Mrs. Rodriguez said one afternoon. 6 months ago, this street was full of suspicion and fear. Now look, Mrs. Chun is organizing a neighborhood book club, Mr. Lee is teaching the children how to grow vegetables, and even Martha Wilson has stopped gossiping and started helping." James nodded, watching his daughter carefully apply brushstrokes under Mrs. Greenwood's gentle guidance. Sometimes it takes a child to remind us of who we're supposed to be. Snowball had become something of a neighborhood mascot, dividing his time between Mrs. Greenwood's sunny windowsills and Melody's art sessions. The cat who had once been used as a pawn in Crown development schemes now represented the bridge between past and present, between solitude and community. He always knew, Mrs. Greenwood told Melody one day as they watched Snowball basking in the sun. He knew you were kind, even when I was too afraid to see it. Animals have a way of recognizing good hearts. The changes in Mrs. Greenwood became more apparent with each passing day. When Mrs. Rodriguez announced the Fall Harvest Festival, Mrs. Greenwood not only attended, but volunteered to judge the children's art contest. She began joining the morning coffee gatherings on various porches, sharing stories about Harold and the neighborhood's happier days. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed teaching, she told James one evening as they watched Melody work on her latest painting. Being alone for so long, it's like I wrapped myself in grief and fear until I couldn't see anything else. The biggest project came when Melody proposed painting a mural on the community center wall. Mrs. Greenwood helped her develop the design, a sprawling scene showing the neighborhood through the seasons, with every house and family represented. We should add Snowball in different places, Melody suggested, sketching ideas in her notebook. Like a game where people have to find him, the mural became a community effort. Mrs. Greenwood taught basic painting techniques to anyone who wanted to help, and soon the wall was filled with adults and children working together, adding their own touches to Melody's design. During one of the painting sessions, Martha Wilson approached Mrs. Greenwood, twisting her apron in her hands. "Eleanor," she said hesitantly, "I need to apologize. All those years, I helped spread rumors and suspicions. I never once asked if you were okay or if you needed help. We all just assumed the worst." Mrs. Greenwood put down her paintbrush. "We all let fear divide us, Martha. But look at us now, painting together, talking again. That's what Harold always said was special about this neighborhood, its ability to come together when it matters." The mural took several weeks to complete, but the result was worth every minute. It showed not just the physical landscape of their community, but its heart. Children playing, neighbors helping each other, gardens growing, and yes, Snowball appearing in various hiding spots throughout the scene. One evening, as Melody added the final touches to her section of the mural, Mrs. Greenwood watched with proud tears in her eyes. She thought about the frightened, lonely woman she'd been just months ago, and how a child's simple act of kindness had broken through decades of fear and isolation. The next day, Mrs. Greenwood asked James to bring Melody to her house after school. The art studio had been specially prepared, with a new easel set up near the window, Melody's favorite spot for painting. "I have something for you," Mrs. Greenwood said, bringing out a beautifully wrapped package. "Something that belonged to another young artist who brought light into my life." Melody carefully unwrapped the package to find a professional artist's case made of polished wood. Inside, nestled in velvet lining, were top-quality paints, brushes, and tools, the kind that serious artists use. "This was my daughter Sarah's," Mrs. Greenwood explained softly. "She loved to paint, just like you. After she moved away, after I lost Harold, I packed it away with everything else that reminded me of happiness. But now I know that's not what Sarah or Harold would have wanted. Art should be alive, bringing joy and healing to others, just like you've brought to this neighborhood." Melody ran her fingers over the brushes reverently. "But Mrs. Greenwood, this is too special. I'm just learning." "You're more than just learning, dear. You're teaching all of us how to see beauty again, how to trust, how to be brave enough to be kind." Mrs. Greenwood hugged the little girl close. "Besides, Sarah called last week. She's coming to visit next month, and she wants to meet the young artist who helped bring her mother back to life." Through the studio window, they could see neighbors gathering for the evening art class that Mrs. Greenwood had started teaching in her garden. James was helping Mr. Lee set up chairs while Mrs. Rodriguez distributed her famous lemonade. Snowball watched from his favorite windowsill, occasionally meowing his approval of the scene below. "You know what the best part is?" Melody said, carefully arranging her new art supplies on the desk Mrs. Greenwood had refinished for her. "Nobody looks scared anymore. Everyone smiles and waves, just like in my pictures." Mrs. Greenwood smiled, watching as more neighbors arrived for the class, each bringing something to share: food, stories, friendship. The fear that had held her prisoner for so long had been transformed into something beautiful, all because a little girl had been brave enough to reach out with cookies and a hand-painted card. "Well," she said, picking up her own brushes, "shall we show them how it's done?" Together, they set up their easels by the window, Snowball purring between them, as the sound of laughter and friendly conversation drifted up from the garden below. The late afternoon sun painted everything in warm golden light, making the scene look just like one of Melody's paintings, full of color, life, and most importantly, love. 6 months after the events that transformed Maple Avenue, Melody stood nervously before her latest artwork at the regional youth art competition. The piece she'd entered, titled "The Heart of a Neighborhood," showed Mrs. Greenwood's Victorian house as it appeared in different seasons, with various scenes of community life playing out in each panel. Mrs. Greenwood squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Remember what I told you about art, dear? It's not about winning," Melody recited, though her eyes remained fixed on the judges making their way down the line of submissions. "It's about sharing your heart with others." James watched proudly from the sidelines with Mrs. Rodriguez and several other neighbors who had come to support Melody. The competition had drawn young artists from across the state, but Melody's piece stood out, not just for its technical skill, but for the story it told. "The colors here," one judge commented, studying the autumn panel. "The way the light hits the house. Extraordinary depth for someone so young. Look at the details," another pointed out. "Every window tells a different story." "And is that the same cat appearing in each scene?" Melody nodded eagerly. "That's Snowball. He's kind of like the neighborhood guardian angel now." When the winners were announced, Melody's name echoed through the exhibition hall. As she accepted her first-place ribbon, the judges praised not just her artistic talent, but the way her work captured the spirit of community and transformation. The victory sparked a celebration that spread far beyond the competition. The residents of Maple Avenue decided to organize a block party unlike anything they'd seen before. The entire street was closed to traffic. Tables lined the sidewalks groaning with food from every cultural tradition represented in their community, and strings of lights transformed the evening into something magical. Officer Reynolds, now wearing his new detective's badge, joined the celebration with his family. His promotion had come with commendations for not just solving the Crown Development case, but for his role in healing community police relations. "You know," he told James as they watched children playing games in the street, "what happened here is being used as a case study at the academy now. How to build trust, how to really serve and protect a community." The party reached its peak when Mrs. Greenwood made her announcement. Standing on her porch, with Snowball perched regally beside her, and Melody holding her hand, she addressed her neighbors. "My house has been many things over the years," she began. "A home, a fortress, even a symbol of fear and isolation. But thanks to a little girl's courage and kindness, it's becoming something new. Starting next month, I'm opening the Eleanor and Harold Greenwood Art Center for Children." The crowd erupted in applause as Mrs. Greenwood explained her vision. Free art classes for neighborhood children, a space for community gatherings, and a scholarship program funded by the settlement from Crown Development. "Harold always believed in investing in community," she continued, her voice strong and clear. "He would have loved seeing our home filled with children's laughter and creativity." James had his own announcement to make. Inspired by the changes he'd witnessed, he'd started a mentoring program at the hospital where he worked, connecting young people interested in healthcare with medical professionals. "Sometimes," he told the gathering, "it takes a child to show us the way. My daughter taught me that one small act of kindness can ripple out and change not just a neighborhood, but the world." The changes on Maple Avenue continued to unfold. Howard Carter's house, seized as part of the criminal investigation, was sold to the Williams family, a young couple with 3 children who brought new energy to the street. Their youngest daughter immediately signed up for Mrs. Greenwood's art classes. "It's like watching the neighborhood heal itself," Mrs. Rodriguez observed one morning during the daily coffee gathering on Mrs. Greenwood's porch. The art center was buzzing with activity inside, children's voices mixing with the sound of brushes on canvas and Snowball's contented purring. Melody, now preparing for her next art competition, had set up her easel in her favorite spot by the window in Mrs. Greenwood's studio. She was working on a special project, a series of paintings documenting the neighborhood's transformation. What made you decide to leave those cookies that day? Mrs. Greenwood asked her one afternoon, watching the little girl work. Melody paused, brush hovering over her canvas. I saw you looking out your window one day, and you looked so sad. My daddy says everyone needs a friend, especially when they're sad. And friends bring cookies, right? Mrs. Greenwood smiled, remembering how afraid she'd been of that simple gift. Your kindness broke through 20 years of fear, dear heart. Do you know that? I just wanted to be your friend, Melody said simply, adding another careful brushstroke to her painting. I didn't know it would change everything, but it had changed everything. The neighborhood that had once been divided by suspicion and fear now gathered regularly for community events. Children played freely in yards that had once been forbidden territory. The community garden that Mr. Lee had started behind the art center was flourishing, providing fresh vegetables and a place for neighbors to work together. Even the physical appearance of Maple Avenue had transformed. Houses that had fallen into disrepair were being restored, gardens bloomed where weeds had grown, and the sound of friendly greetings replaced suspicious silence. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, Melody sat at her special desk in the art studio, working on something secret. Mrs. Greenwood pretended not to notice, busying herself with preparing for the next day's classes. Finally, Melody approached with a card in her hands. Unlike her first card to Mrs. Greenwood, this one showed not just Snowball but a whole scene. Mrs. Greenwood teaching art to neighborhood children, James mentoring young doctors, Officer Reynolds playing basketball with local kids, and residents sharing meals and stories on connected porches. The message inside read simply, "Thank you for being my friend." Mrs. Greenwood held the card carefully, tears filling her eyes. On her lap, Snowball purred contentedly, while through the window came the sounds of children laughing, neighbors chatting, and a general happy buzz of a community that had rediscovered its heart. You know, Mrs. Greenwood said, placing the card on her mantel next to the original one that had started everything. Harold used to say that love is the only force strong enough to overcome fear. But I think he forgot one thing. Sometimes that love comes in the form of cookies and a hand-painted card from a brave little girl. Melody smiled, already reaching for her brushes again. Can we paint together? I want to try catching the way the sunset makes the windows look like they're full of fire. As they set up their easels side by side, just as they had done so many times before, the late afternoon light streamed through the windows of the old Victorian house. It caught the dust motes dancing in the air, transformed ordinary objects into things of beauty, and illuminated the two artists, one young and one old, both creating something new and beautiful together. Outside, Maple Avenue continued its daily life, but it was a different street now. Where fear had once cast shadows, kindness had brought light. Where suspicion had built walls, friendship had opened doors. And where an elderly woman had once lived in isolation, there was now a home filled with art, laughter, and the boundless energy of children learning to express themselves. The story of the little girl who left cookies for a lonely neighbor had become part of the neighborhood's legend, told and retold as an example of how the smallest act of kindness could spark the biggest changes. But for Melody, painting quietly beside her friend while Snowball watched from his windowsill, it was simply the story of how she had found her second home, her art teacher, and a friend who understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is open your heart to others. As the sun set on another day on Maple Avenue, the old Victorian house glowed with warmth and purpose, its windows bright with promise, its doors open to all who sought friendship, creativity, and the courage to be kind. In the end, Melody's innocence and bravery brought a fractured community closer together, proving that even small acts of kindness can spark big changes. But what would you have done if you were in Melody's shoes, or Mrs. Greenwood's? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story full of suspense, heartbreak, and hope, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon for more stories that will leave you inspired and thinking long after they're over. See you in the next one.